ground control to Major Tom.
I think it's good to be your best critic and to self-reflect. And I am constantly learning from everybody. I'll pick up pearls in almost every conversation that I have. And when you and I are done, I will write, 3 things in my journal on,
I
Dr.
hope
Schein.
number one is never agree to be on Scheinbart's
No,
podcast.
not at all. But it absolutely, you have to be a servant leader and have the humility that you don't know everything.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade. And the papers want to know whose shirt you wear. Now it's time to leave the capsule if you dare.
Hello, and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I am your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you the hottest and most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership today. Today, it is my pleasure to bring Dr. J.D. Polk, the Chief Health and Medical Officer of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, onto our show. Dr. Polk earned his medical degree in osteopathic medicine from the A.T. Still University in Kirksville, Missouri. He completed his residency in emergency medicine with the Mount Sinai Hospitals via Ohio University and completed his training in aerospace medicine at the University of Texas Medical Branch and is board certified in both specialties. Once upon a time, Dr. Polk served as the State Emergency Medical Services Medical Director for the state of Ohio, my home state, and former Chief of Metro Life Flight in Cleveland, Ohio. Following that, he was the Chief of Space Medicine for NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, and later the Assistant Secretary for Health Affairs and Chief Medical Officer for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Prior to serving in his current position at NASA, Dr. Polk was also the Dean of Medicine for Des Moines University's College of Osteopathic Medicine and has served on the board of directors of the American Association for Physician Leadership, an organization dear to my heart, and served also as a member of the American Osteopathic Association's Commission on Osteopathic College Accreditation. Dr. Polk, welcome to the show.
Lee, so good to see you again, and thanks for having me. And well, I think we just took up the entire show just with that bio. So I'm going to have to cut that down a little bit.
Well, there's one missing piece. Would you share with the audience what does JD stand for?
I always tell people I have to know you better before I can tell you that. Because that's how I screen my calls to figure out who actually knows me or not. When they call and ask for Jim or James, I know they don't know me at all. And it stands for James David.
Well, I'm honored to know the secret name, now the secret password. I mean, we've talked half a dozen or more times, but I finally got the inner sanctum language, so appreciate that.
Absolutely.
So let's give the listeners a little bit of a background, and I don't know the answers to these questions myself. What are the top 3 or 4 key responsibilities of being the Chief Health and Medical Officer at NASA?
Yeah, it's an odd intersection between research, medicine, engineering, and so there probably, if you had to cone down to 3, there's a lot of responsibilities, but the biggest ones are keeping the astronauts healthy and being the waiver authority for astronauts, directing the care that is going on to any NASA spacecraft. That includes Orion, that includes the space station, all the vehicles in development. But we also are the technical authority, what we call the health and medical technical authority. Engineers are great at building rockets and engines, but not so good at that squishy thing that rides in the rocket. And so getting all the human factors and human systems engineering, how many G's a human is at the human tolerance, all of those things. Human beings aren't Six Sigma like the rest of engineering. I can't take a human being and put them to failure like you can an engineering part. And that's a lot of what we do is interpreting human physiology for the engineers as they design and build a spacecraft. And then we kind of oversee a lot of that technical aspects, that interface with the human being. And then we also do the occupational health side on OSHA. We have 10 NASA centers that we oversee the medical care at for all the employees that are through NASA, and try to make sure that we are compliant with OSHA and that we are keeping our mishaps and other things down to a minimum. As you can imagine, when you're building rockets and doing all sorts of things at multiple different centers, there's the capacity for those mishaps to occur, and we do a lot of interventions and work with our safety counterparts to try to keep the workplace as safe as possible.
We've had several guests on the show that are former flight surgeons that served in our military, our armed forces, and there are some parallels here, but there are some distinctions. And I remember you sharing with a group of us once about things that happen in space that, for example, if something very critical were to happen at the International Space Station, for example, there are certain parameters that challenge all of you to figure out what is the right thing to do. If you scratch your cornea, for example, you can do something in space about that. But I don't know if you want to elaborate on some of those real hazards that complicate both mission success and health and human safety.
Yeah, the environment of space really does change everything. And like the example you used of scratching your cornea, most people think, well, you'll put some Tobrex eye drops in there and it'll heal if it's not too deep. Well, the aspect of putting eye drops in an eye in space is not very easy. Eye drops don't drop. So you got to squeeze a ball of the Tobrex, and the astronaut, puts their eye in, and surface tension actually allows it to adhere to the eyeball. And uh, you know, we just had this discussion with a group of researchers earlier in the week where we talked about intubation. They said, well, what if you intubated an astronaut and you were going to go do surgery? Well, when you intubate somebody with 100% oxygen in a spacecraft that is an enclosed environment that's at 21% oxygen, like on the ground, 14.7 and 21, you can only keep them intubated for so long before all the bleed off oxygen, if it's not a closed circuit ventilator, starts to raise the oxygen in the cabin, which then takes you to the fire limit. And you have to add nitrogen to the stack in order to lower the fire limit, and trying to figure out the volume and the pressure and get all of those correct. And so it's, everything that we do has to take that environment into account. And, the microgravity is a big thing as well. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of key differences perhaps between us and our military counterparts. Very often in the military, we're a preventive medicine flight surgeon because the missions are very short. You have to keep somebody on a sortie in an aircraft healthy for a couple of hours. And we're keeping people healthy in an environment for months to a year or more. On some of these space flights, and there's a little mix of internal medicine with bone loss and decreased cardiac size and decrease in preload, optic nerve edema, and increased intracranial pressure with that fluid shift. There's all sorts of things that occur in that realm. There's a little bit of emergency medicine when they land and you're having to do IVs and other things to resuscitate them to make sure they're in good shape. So it's an interesting specialty. I always tell the medical students, it's like taking Guyton's physiology and just exploding it, because almost every physiologic parameter or every chapter in Guyton is rewritten for spaceflight because of all the challenges that occur in microgravity.
Yeah, they would prefer to blow up the examination and skip that part because that is a challenging course. But you also allude to, and I'm curious about the physician responsibility that you and your team have relative to mission responsibility. So in military service, if the mission is short and the flight surgeon is signed off, that the pilot is capable of carrying out his or her duties, may be true that the astronaut, the carry load, the squishy load, is capable of participating, but the mission has a priority because of the logistics. And so I wonder if you have any experiences or stories relative to choosing mission over person, limb versus safety, and things of that nature.
Yeah, that's a great thing. We do serve two masters, the mission and the patient. Now, obviously, we do everything to get the patient healthy. And probably one of the more, there's two startling statistics that most people are always enamored by. One is that we are able to get 98% of the astronauts back to flight if they have a medical issue. And part of that is altruism, wanting to make sure that the astronaut can fly. They've worked their whole life to do this thing. But part of it is also mission risk, to make sure that somebody who's been training for 5 years is going to go do that mission versus somebody at the last minute who gets rolled in, who may not be up to the same training or par. But also, we've spent millions of dollars training that person over the last 5 years for that mission. Yeah, and, to go ablate somebody for AFib or A-flutter to the tune of 50 grand is cheap by comparison to the millions that we've done to put somebody in. And we have had cases where we have had to remove an astronaut from flight, and we don't do that lightly. Usually that occurs when we can't remediate their illness or disease in the time period before their flight occurs. And hopefully we'll recycle them in the queue later after we're able to remediate and fix whatever we can. But it does occur, and you have to take, unfortunately, the mission into context as well. We will meet with the head of the astronaut corps. We'll meet with what's called the associate administrator at NASA, or with the administrator at NASA, to go over what that risk is, so they can weigh risk on risk. What is the risk of removing that person who is highly trained from that mission versus the medical risk? But we have had to make those decisions before. They're not done lightly at all. But when they do occur, you have to also balance the risk to the other crew. That if this person has a medical issue that could imperil either the mission or the other crew, then that has to go into the equation. And in military, sometimes you've got a host of other pilots, F-16 pilots or somebody else that might be able to fly that mission or that sortie. And that may not necessarily be the case at NASA, where you have a backup, but they, because of the amount of time and expense to train somebody in the neutral buoyancy lab, you've seen that huge pool where we do practice EVAs and other things, that the backup may not be trained on par with the prime individual, and it may take them some time to get up to speed. And so the sooner you can make a decision medically, the better. Sometimes diagnoses don't cooperate. We have had people, let's take that AFib or A-flutter example. We've had multiple cases of that. We've had 5 cases of that. But what we do is a little different. We don't just send them to the local guy to do an ablation. We've spent millions of dollars training them, so we're going to find the guy who has the best skills and the best metrics and the best outcomes, for ablations, and then we're going to go and educate them on the nuances of spaceflight physiology and other things that we are worried about. So that we decrease any risk or risk to outcomes there. An AFib or A-flutter, very often, first when you catheterize somebody and you go up into the right heart, you ablate the right heart, and you poke through the atria and ablate any foci that are on the left. Well, that poke through the atria can create, a foramen or an area for nitrogen bubbles to pass through. And so we had to work with folks to make sure that the catheter that was going to be used to poke through the atria was the smallest of size, in hopes that hole would heal and not be enduring and create a nidus for nitrogen bubbles to go through when you've got somebody in a spacesuit where that bubble can then go up to the brain. And so it's small things like that where even nuanced therapies and treatments you're used to doing those on the ground, but then when we go and educate folks, hey, in this context, here's what we're worried about. They're always amazed at all the different things that spaceflight really adds to the dimension of medical care and treatment and considerations when we're taking care of folks. But we
So
do
you're not our average flight surgeon by any stretch of the imagination.
well. I, I I don't know about that. I would say that the cadre we have. I'm privileged to lead this cadre. There are folks that are um, multi board certified. In hyperbarics and aerospace and their prime specialty. That's probably the one thing about aerospace medicine at NASA is we do require folks be board certified and that they also be trained in an ACGME approved program in aerospace. And it's really highly technical, highly focused cadre. Even many of the physicians also have degrees in engineering from several from MIT and others. So, I mean, there are some smart folks working on space flight, at least in the medical cadre.
Yeah, there are so many leadership lessons here for the average hospital chief medical officer. You want to credential the right people. You want the right people in your facility doing the right thing. So NASA as an agency also wants the skilled, trained, technically competent individuals signing off with a deep bench knowledge of aerospace medicine, as you just alluded to. Let's go back just a moment in this leadership lesson. You talked about risk on risk. In our training, before we get into our adulthood, a lot of the things we're taught are that premise do no harm, risk benefit ratio, and as physicians, we will be trained again and again and again to perform something to the extent that we can accomplish that and minimize harm or minimize risk. But in aerospace medicine, when we're comparing it to the mission, as you said, risk on risk, mission versus man, gender non-specific here, the squishy versus the hard. And I do know that our listeners are in these ambiguous spaces of leadership. The organization is going here. The organization has certain needs and responsibilities. And then there are needs and responsibilities relative to patient care. And leadership requires a skill set of dealing with that ambiguity and knowing a process by which we can make the best decision under the parameters by which we're making it. And I really valued that story because I think our listeners, when they think about it in terms of their leadership responsibilities, it'll be a little bit easier for them to process how decisions get made when you go beyond training and get into a leadership responsibility. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And we take that risk and we try to take a medical risk and apply it in some of the same terminology that our engineers use so that they can compare apples to apples. And at NASA, we use a 5x5 risk matrix with consequence on one side and likelihood on the other. And we use green, yellow, red stoplight chart. And as you get closer to that 3x5 and 4x5 risk, then you get into the red. And we have what's called fault tolerance or reliability that we have to use in spaceflight. And so I'll give you an example from the aviation industry. When a aircraft, if you and I are flying to Orlando tomorrow and the gear doesn't come down, the pilot doesn't come on and say, "Hey, sorry, it's a bad day to fly today. We're all going to die." You have a backup hydraulic system that will try to lower that gear. And then thanks to or after the Sioux City, Iowa mishap, there's actually a second mitigation step where they could potentially manually crank that gear down. And so that's called two-fault tolerance. You have your initial system, and then you have a backup that's one fault tolerant, and then a second backup, which is two fault tolerances. And we do that in medicine, but we don't call it the same thing, right? So, uh, somebody comes into the emergency department tomorrow, and I got to intubate them. Well, I've got my laryngoscope, or my video scope. If you're in the high tech emergency department, but if I can't get the airway, I could do an obturator airway. There's a second fault tolerance, or I could do a cricothyrotomy. That's dual fault tolerance. If I can't get that airway, we don't say, sorry, it's a bad day. I couldn't intubate. We're done. Sorry, it's a bad.
Right, right, right.
We call it quits, but we don't call it that same thing, right? But it is the same. It is the likelihood of a difficult airway is not zero. And the consequence is very high if you can't get the airway. And so for things that are in the red, like a difficult airway, we have fault tolerance as well. But we don't use that same language or speak, but it's exactly the same concept.
Yeah, so in leadership development, physician leadership development, and when you sat on the board at AAPL, one of the things we want to impart to people is you have this mysterious medical language that you doctors can talk about with each other, and nobody else understands what you're talking about. But in administrative settings, financial settings, organizational, operational project settings, you as a physician leader have to learn a new language. To your point about speaking like the engineers, they need to understand what you're talking about. So it is incumbent upon you as a leader to talk and know their language, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
As the space industry evolves, I imagine we're going to see more manned missions around the globe, yes?
Mhm.
And so do you believe we will need more chief medical or chief health and medical officers in the industry? And what do you think about the future in terms of medical officers and the space industry?
Yeah, there are a lot of, I'll call them actors for lack of a better word, a lot of different increasing actors in the spaceflight, you know, world and human spaceflight world. It used to be just three dominant people: Soviet Union, now Russia, the United States, and China. Sending people to space. But India, very soon, we've been working with India to get their vehicle human rated and to help them with the requirements and standards. They're going to be probably the fourth spacefaring nation coming up in the next year and a half.
Spacefaring nation, what a
Spacefaring nation, isn't
term.
that what a term? So that's quickly on the heels, but as most people have seen, the commercial space flight is taking off. And it took off at a fairly rapid rate. I think most of us thought it was going to be just suborbital initially. Go up 4 minutes of weightlessness, like you see with William Shatner or Katy Perry or whoever up in space, and then down, right? And
Right.
so don't have to really do a lot of physical exam or credentialing or things to make sure somebody can tolerate 4 minutes of microgravity. Yeah, that's a pretty low threshold to meet versus spending a year in microgravity.
Right.
But also rapidly, those flights, although they've been flying a lot of people, you've probably seen with Blue Origin going up, sending multiple folks up, Virgin Galactic doing suborbital flights. But very quickly, we saw SpaceX go to the Polaris missions that Jared Isaacman had funded, which were orbital missions, and the first commercial private spacewalk that he and one of his crewmates performed. Axiom contracting with SpaceX as their vehicle to ferry astronauts to the International Space Station. NASA now also working with commercial entities to empower and help fund commercial space stations as a replacement for the ISS, potentially up to 3 commercial space stations. And so it's really morphing rapidly into a commercially viable spaceflight field. What's going to be different and why we'll need not only CMOs, but very savvy clinicians is many of the commercial entity and the FAA requirements who certify commercial entities and the passengers and or pilots. Right now, the FAA is not allowed to write requirements for the pilots. or I'm sorry, the passengers. They can write requirements for the pilots, but not the passengers. So
Right.
Katy Perry didn't have a standard that she had to meet to fly, and as a passenger. You and I, when we go on United and book our flight, there's not a series of questions asking us about coronary disease, our blood pressure, our glucose, et cetera, right? So part of that is self-declaring whether or not you are healthy enough for a flight, especially for suborbital. We'll see what happens with orbital or as things evolve. What they will fly in space. FAA will probably eventually have some requirements, but they won't look like NASA requirements. And so they're going to fly probably a much different pathology, for lack of a better word, than I did. We're looking at it, as you mentioned, for the risk to the mission as well as the risk to the individual. They may not be looking at it with that same lens. They're looking at it through a public safety lens. Is the vehicle safe enough that it's not going to crash into a school or et cetera on takeoff, that kind of thing. So FAA has a public safety mission. They don't have a mission of, hey, make sure that Axiom's missions is successful.
Yeah, that's really that will play itself out, and hopefully the right people will be thinking carefully about this. Well, look, there's a real specific reason, and we've talked about this, why I wanted you on the show, among many other cool things, is you recently spent time at Oxford in England, right?
Mhm.
And you also mentioned that the timing was very beneficial to you, perhaps for recharge, rejuvenation, but you also discovered a bit of a new paradigm for leadership scholars to consider, and in particular, perhaps for healthcare leadership right now. We live in very disruptive times in general for a lot of different reasons, and certainly in healthcare over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly relative to the pandemic, but just some of the massive changes and advancements. And did you physically spend time with Jonathan Trevor?
I did. The program was the Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Program, which you might argue, what's the chief medical officer need to go to the Advanced Management and Leadership Program? You've been the chief medical officer for almost a decade, and have been in leadership for 2 decades. But as you and I both know, you're never done. You're never done learning. And we were going through a big transition. We go through transitions with every presidential administration, as we all do, but this one was perhaps a little bit larger transition. And I needed to know as much as possible on transformational leadership and how best to help my people succeed. And the odd thing about politics, sometimes you're a spectator and sometimes you feel like you're a spectator in the middle of the arena and the lion's on one side and the gladiators on the other.
Gladiator.
Yeah. And so, this was a time where I felt I needed to get out of my normal headspace and learn some new thoughts, new techniques, things that were out there in the leadership realm, and to make sure that I was putting on my best leadership abilities for my team. My team works extraordinarily hard, and we have a very high ops tempo. I owed it to my team and that how I show up matters. And so Jonathan was one of the lecturers there, and I enjoyed his presentations and his lectures immensely. But there were some elements that he brought into that lecture from the book that he had written, Realign, and I'll probably distill it too simply, but essentially it is, look. Most of us, when we write a strategic plan, we write some glossy strategic plan with lofty words and it sits on a shelf. But really, in leadership, there's always something occurring, whether it's, competition builds a freestanding ER a block away, or there's a pandemic, God forbid, or, you've got a massive budget cut, or you've got X or Y, or you've got a problem on the HR side. There's always something that's going on that is testing whether or not your ability to lead and keep your alignment towards your goal and your purpose. And so you're never quite done. You always have to go and reevaluate and at multiple different periods to see, are you aligned or do you need to realign to keep that North Star and that purpose moving? And some of the tidbits I won't share all of them because people probably need to read it themselves. But that book particularly resonated with me for what we're going through right now. But there's some elements to that I had to reconcile. That there are things that are beyond my control. I don't control Congress. I don't control the White House. I don't control what the space policy is going to be. But those levers that are within my control, um, I need to look at, and I need to think outside the box. If there are other levers that I've not even, sampled or thought about, and try to do everything that I can to realign the organization with the tools that we've been given to the purpose that we need to execute, which is flying people safely in space. And so I got to tell you, there were phenomenal amount of lectures and learning at that course. It was a month long. The first week and a half was challenging because they really break down some barriers. When you go in, no one's allowed to have a title, so nobody. There were CEOs and presidents, and I think I was the only CMO. But I was just one of two physicians in the class. But nobody was allowed to share their abstract of what their CV was, or et cetera. And then we were sharing a lot of personal fears, details. We got into how do you lead, but also if you're not leading yourself well, you can't lead other people. And you and I know that firsthand. That if your own life's a train wreck, whether it's your marriage, whether it's your physical health, whether it's pick something that acts as such a distraction that if you can't lead yourself, you're not a very effective leader leading others. And so there's a lot of things there that just resonated with me throughout that program. But
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, when the AAPL approached me to redesign the Chief Medical Officer Academy, one of the things we agreed upon was to structure that this is about the role, but in disguise. It'll be a leadership program where we're talking about self-leadership, leading others, leading teams, and leading the organization. And it starts at that basic leading of the self. That sounds like a phenomenal program. And you articulate another key leadership lesson, and that is, you said you're never done, which I agree with. And it is an imperative to continue to learn how to lead. And what I understand, and I will be reading probably both of his books, starting with, I think he wrote the book called Align or Alignment.
yeah,
And he had this light bulb epiphany later. Yes, there is alignment in strategic planning and strategic thinking, but in the world we live in, the skill we need to start to appreciate is how to realign when it's not just a single factor coming at you, but there are multifactorial disruptions in your ecosystem. And it's like guiding that cruise ship. And you know this in spaceflight, 1 degree can cause you to go thousands, and in your case, millions of miles off course.
yeah,
Yes. So a lot of leadership lessons there, and I will
yeah.
encourage the listeners to pay attention to what Dr. Polk is talking about, which is you're never done. Be curious, always learning. Get out of your own way sometimes and rejuvenate your leadership skill set and learn new things. It will make you and the team and the organization much better at what you're being asked to do. Do you, as you think about, and you have been in medical education and you lead people and you lead teams, you think about some of the young aspiring physician leaders that are coming behind you and I into different roles and different experiences. Are there any key pearls that you've kept along the way that you want to share with our folks about career trajectory, leadership? Anything coming to mind?
Well, for me at least, there's a couple things. When I am talking to some of the flight surgeons that are looking to advance in management, and especially when we're we're going through a phase right now where we are decreasing budgets and decreasing people at NASA, and sometimes you'll get new folks that come in and say, well, let's get rid of this thing. Let's get rid of this. Sometimes your leadership lessons come from outside leadership and outside medicine and outside science. And the one that kind of resonates with me in this particular environment is a parable from the English author G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton has this parable about the fence. And the parable is you're going down a path and you see this this fence or this gate that is blocking your way, and your first instinct is to eliminate it, just get rid of it. And Chesterton says, I'll let you get rid of that when you can tell me why somebody put it there in the first place. What, somebody went to all the trouble to pound the posts in the ground and build the fence or the gate. And so when you can explain to me holistically why it's there, why it was put there, what purpose it serves, and that it no longer serves that purpose, then I'll let you take it down. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to explain to somebody, where they want to go dismantle something, but they don't understand why it's there. What's the requirement? Is it an OSHA requirement? Is it a NASA requirement? Is it mission risk or something else? Because they have not done a deep enough dive to understand why it exists in the first place. And there are some times when it's legacy items where okay, yeah, let's take it down. But I've taught a couple of the flight surgeons that parable, and so now I can tell that I'm getting old when they start quoting it back to me. When we'll be in a meeting and I'll say, okay, well, and they'll say, oh yeah, I know Chesterton's fence. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. You can tell me what the use of it is, then I'll let you take it down. But it's kind of that holistic mindset that, and also, especially when things are difficult, you're losing people or you're losing budget, passions can get inflamed, and there's a quote from a general that I like, a British general, Ian Gardner, that I met in Scotland. We were on a train together and had dinner on this train, and Ian said, the leader has to be the banker of hope, and they can never allow themselves to appear bankrupt. And I love that quote because your people look to you for hope, for a plan, that for confidence that we're going to get through these difficult times. And if you can show that kind of EQ, and you can show that you are governing your own passions, you're not getting upset, you're not talking ill about leadership, you're not throwing people under the bus, et cetera, or doing things that are unprofessional, and you have a cogent plan and you attack every obstacle as though it is something to that will get you forward. I think Ryan Holiday has that book, The Obstacle is the Way, right? So, which is a quote from Marcus Aurelius. So there's a couple of things there where, a lot of it has to do with your leadership acumen and some experience, but a lot of it is how you present to your team. And it's taken me a long time to learn a lot of those lessons, but probably one of the things I recommend to newer CMOs and leaders is to keep a journal. I write in a journal, whether you want to call it a diary or a journal. Sometimes I'll, if I hear a quote like from Ian Gardner, yeah, it goes in that night. Sometimes I'll write what I'm grateful for. Sometimes, I use it to hold myself accountable for exercise, for this, for that, for journal reading, for all of those things. And also I write it to reflect where I think I didn't do so hot in a meeting. Of, hey, you interrupted so and so 5 times during that time, and you didn't let them speak. You didn't make them feel heard. And so it's, I think it's good to be your best critic and to and self-reflect. But those are some of the tools that I use personally and have helped me on that journey. And I am constantly learning from everybody. I'll pick up pearls in almost every conversation that I have. And when you and I are done, I will write, 3 things in my journal on,
I
Dr.
hope
Schein.
number one is never agree to be on Scheinbart's
No,
podcast.
not at all. But it absolutely not at all. But it's, all of those things. And you have to be a servant leader and have the humility that you don't know everything.
Yeah, yeah. There are a lot of phenomenal parallels, and I tell this to our leaders in our academy, to our physician education. First time you have to learn how to engage and take a history and physical, your responsibility is to give open and inquisitive questions, but listen first. Seek first to understand. The patient will give you that diagnosis if you're thoughtful and careful and listen to them. And that's an Oslerian theme. They will present this information to you if you're patient. As we go through our training, when did it start? When did it stop? We start firing questions, and the average physician only listens about 7 seconds before interrupting the patient. So, yeah, why is the fence there? What was its purpose? Seek first to understand, which is a derivation of the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. These are things that we're taught very early in our education, and we tend to lose sight of them, and we need to step back and remember these principles are tried and true. They're truisms, and it allows us to be a better leader. I totally agree with everything that you're sharing. Well, this has been a fantastic and amazing show. I'll give you one lesson that I learned, and it will mess with your space flight mind. A leader out in California once, in reference to the comments you just made, said the role of the leader is to breathe oxygen into hope. We don't. We exhale. We don't exhale oxygen, but we do put it in the room, and that elevates our hope. And again, our physician students, they are taught sometimes the only thing you might be able to offer to the patient in the absence of the intervention or the treatment is a measure of hope, even in their dying days. And so we breathe oxygen into hope. Maybe not in space, or maybe not here, but maybe underwater. I don't know. Well, anyway, this has been a great show. I appreciate you very much. This is the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. If you want access to the hottest items on physician leadership, how to become a CMO, visit our website, thefirechiefcmo.com, and sign up with us. Leave your comments. Tell us what the next hot mess in healthcare is all about, and we'll tell you how to align and realign and what physician leaders should be doing about it. I love talking with physician leaders and chief medical officers from all over the United States, so please connect, leave your reviews, leave your comments, and share this with your colleagues. And in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.